Hi everyone, welcome. This is National Master Dennis Monokroussos, and this is our fourth week in our lecture series here. Today we're going to take a look at a game that's much less wild and attacking than the previous games we've seen. And in fact, it may put some of you to sleep, but I hope not. So I'm kind of being facetious here. It's an opening, though, that is perhaps not one of the most popular in chess, but I think you can use that to your advantage. It's the Berlin defense. So I'm going to show you a game that I played a few weeks ago against Richard Stivelband, who I think is from Ohio. He's a master. And I had black in this game, and as we'll see, the Berlin defense worked quite efficiently here. So we'll talk a little bit about it, and, well, hopefully the result of this is that you'll be much more interested in this opening, and at least you'll understand it better. Worst comes to worst. So here we go. So we've got the Rui, there's the Berlin, and Stivelband went for the main line. Okay, so what's going on here? And I'll just say a few words by way of general overview about this opening. Now for black, his big trump is this bishop on e6, and the control over the light squares that in part is because of the bishop, in part because this pawn on e5 is a bit overextended. And, well, that's really what black has going for him. And this bishop also, in some cases, when it goes to e6, can also do quite a bit of damage on this diagonal against white's queenside, as we'll see, or from f5 correspondingly hitting c2. So that's really what makes black's engine go, is this light squared bishop. And I would suggest that some of you who are interested in pursuing this further take a look at a game, I think, between the computer engine Rebel and Anand. I would just say look up Anand and C67, that's the ECO database code for the Berlin defense, and with him as black. And you'll find it. It's a game against the computer engine. And he won a long game, but it was actually a very easy game where he was winning strategically around move 30 or so, if not sooner. And it was essentially, it got to an off-color bishop ending, and the problem was that there was just no way for white to really fight against this light square bishop and the control that he had. So that's what what black has going for him in the Berlin defense. That's the big trump. And also the queenside majority, surprisingly, perhaps, but it is indeed the case that this majority can prove very meaningful. Even though it's crippled by the double pawn, it can actually be very useful. Okay, white's big advantages are two, or his, I don't know if they're big advantages, but his advantages, their significant advantages, are two. So first is that he's going to have a much easier time developing his pieces because of black's king on d8. So the king on d8, it's not that it's going to get mated or anything, but because it's on the back rank and it's not really going to be comfortable on e7 or d7 either. So you can see all four of these squares are less than ideal with respect to getting the king out of the way of the pieces. On d7, well, first of all, it's not going to be safe there because the d file's open. On e7, it'll get in the way of the bishop on f8 some of the time, and also the knight from f5 often wants to use e7 as well. On e8, it's still in the way of the rook on h8, and of course on d8, it's in the way of the rook on a8. So that's the problem. And while black is busy figuring out what in the world to do with his king and his rooks, and also this bishop on f8 sometimes has trouble getting developed too, white's going to be developing and getting on with his major plan. And that major plan is to get these kingside pawns rolling. So if white can get, let's say, pawns safely on f5 to go, a pawn safely on f5 to go with a pawn on e5, he'll be in great shape. And of course, he's got a kingside majority, so he ought to use it. Okay, so that's in very, very broad brushstrokes what's going on, where a lot of the battle is ultimately going to take place. But in terms of the specifics, well, that's what makes the Berlin really fascinating. It's an opening that requires a good deal of flexibility, or at least you have to be more flexible and patient than your opponent. So there's this joke where you've got an American and a Russian, and they're in the jungle running away from a lion, and the American stops to put on some sneakers, and the Russian kind of laughs at him and says, "What, are you going to outrun the lion?" And the American says, "No, I just have to outrun you." And it's the same thing here in the Berlin. You don't necessarily have to have the the patience of Buddha or anything like that, or at least of Kramnik. All you have to do is be more patient than your opponent, and that'll often pay dividends. So if you know what you're doing to some extent, and you have a reasonable degree of patience, this is an opening you can play to win. So even if, equality in the Berlin defense doesn't often mean boring equality. It means a dynamic equality, an equality that involves real imbalances of the pawn structure, of space, of minor pieces, lots of fun stuff. So it's not a stale, dry position at all. Okay, so in this position, white plays knight c3. I should also say a couple other things, just briefly, in terms of exchanges. So generally speaking, black would like to trade this bishop for this knight, if he can, without going through too many contortions. Trading the dark square bishops is generally slightly in white's favor, but it's not a horrible trade for black. And black does not want to exchange off this bishop on c8 if he can at all avoid it. So what that means is that he can't just rush this bishop to e6, which is where it would ideally go because of knight to g5. So for that reason, one kind of common move here is to play h6. There's nothing wrong with h6, but there's a fundamental choice here for black, which concerns what he does with his king. Does he bring it to the e8 and clear d8 for the rook and basically get it out of everybody's way except for the rook on h8? Or does he try for this more ambitious but slower plan of bringing the king over to the queen side? So if he can get the king to b7, then it's out of the way of everybody. And so that's really terrific. But it's a little bit tougher to achieve. So if you played, for example, if we played h6, the problem is that now you can't get in the king to the queen side plan. So rook to d1, bishop d7, g4, and now e6. And e6 is a nasty little tactic that shows up quite regularly in the Berlin. And in this position it just wins, because f takes c6 and knight e5 with the double attack with the hit on the bishop on d7, but then also the fork on f7. So, since I wanted to play the king to the queen side plan, I had to play bishop to d7. So there's always little concessions here. So ideally, I want to have h6, bishop e6, and king c8, but I have to pick between them. I can't play bishop d6 right away. I can play h6, but I can't play h6 and get my king to the queen side. So if I want my king to the queen side, I've got to play bishop to d7. Okay, white played b3. I played h6. He played bishop to b2, king c8, rook a to d1. Notice the rook, it's the queen rook that goes to d1. So white could play all the way back here, something like rook to d1 check, but that really wouldn't achieve anything. Or let's say bishop g5, king e8, rook to d1. This is in fact just nothing for white, because black plays bishop to e6. He's going to follow up with h6, and all these pieces are getting to great squares, and for free, because the bishop on g5 is going to have to move. The rook on d1 leaves the rook on a1 out of a job. So, again, both sides have to be patient and flexible in how they handle this position. All right, so back to the game. Rook a to d1. Now I play b6. And now my opponent makes a good waiting move. It would be very logical for white to play rook to d2, which, as I mentioned before, well, I didn't mention, but the point would be just to double rooks, which is quite logical. But as I mentioned before, then